Higham, and you are watching KMBC Morning News. Today is January 12, 1970, and the city is still alive and hopping from the Chiefs' Super Bowl victory last night. The Chiefs came into the game as 12-point underdogs, but they sure played like they were favored. Kansas City only scored 3 points on a 48-yard field goal by Han Stinyard in the first quarter, but it was enough to take the lead heading into the second quarter. Stinyard would go on to kick 2 more field goals, leaving the Vikings with still no answer. The score was 9-0 in favor of the Chiefs when Kansas City's own Mike Garrett added a 5-yard touchdown run to make it 16-0 at halftime. Minnesota finally got on the scoreboard in the third quarter with a Dave Osborne 4-yard run to make it 16-7. As the Vikings came closer to reaching distance, the fans were ecstatic to finally have a game on their hands. The Chiefs answered with yet another touchdown when Otis Taylor pulled in a 46-yard pass from quarterback Lynn Dawson, making it 23-7. The score stayed the same for the rest of the game, as the Vikings were continuously shut down by the indestructible Chiefs. Since it's the first couple of days in the first month of a new decade, we are going to take you on a flashback of the early 1960s, of the most important events that happened and how our society has changed in just 10 years. The presidential election was one of the closest elections so far in the history of America. The Republican was Richard Nixon of California, who was relatively young, but also experienced as the nation's vice president for 8 years under Dwight Eisenhower. The Democratic newcomer was John F. Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts who at the age of 43 could become the youngest person to ever be elected president. Regardless of the outcome, the U.S. would for the first time have a leader born in the 20th century. Nixon stressed his steadfast commitment to fighting communism. He had made a name for himself as a staunch red baiter in the past-war era, leading the charge against alleged spy Alger Hiss. Nixon also emphasized the importance of his 8 years as vice president. Kennedy stressed his character, assisted by those in the press who reported stories about his World War II heroism. Courage and character became the major themes in Kennedy's campaign. In such a close contest, every event mattered. Many analysts suggested that the decisive battle in the campaign was waged during the televised presidential debates. Kennedy arrived for the debates well-tanned and well-rested from Florida, while Nixon was recovering from a knee injury he suffered in a tiresome whistle-stop campaign. Kennedy was extremely telegenic and comfortable before the camera. Nixon was nervous, sweated profusely under the hot lights, and couldn't find a good enough makeup artist to hide his dark, saggy bags under his eyes. Radio listeners of the first debate narrowly awarded Nixon a victory, while the larger television audience believed Kennedy won by a wide margin. When the votes were tallied in November, Kennedy earned 49.7% of the popular vote to Nixon's 49.5%. Kennedy pulled only about 100,000 more votes than Nixon out of the 68 million votes cast. Despite Nixon winning more states than Kennedy, the Electoral College awarded Kennedy the victory by a 303 to 219 margin. People on that evening went to bed thinking that Nixon had won and were shocked when they awoke to find that Kennedy had won by a landslide with the Electoral College's votes. This election was just the start of causing people in America to question what could and couldn't happen. We will be right back after these short messages. Those big bouffant hairstyles and all that icky hairspray have changed a lot, but hairspray hasn't until today. A soft new hairspray called Rave. This is the old hairspray, and this is the new hairspray. This hairspray is all nice and easy to get through, and this one's all rough and The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 was an unsuccessful invasion of Cuba by Cuban exiles that was supported by the U.S. government. On April 17, 1961, an armed force of about 1,500 exiles landed on the south coast of Cuba. Trained since May of 1960 by the CIA with the approval of the Eisenhower administration, the rebels intended to foment an insurrection in Cuba and overthrow the communist regime of Fidel Castro. The Cuban army easily defeated the rebels, and by April 20th, most of the Cuban exiles were either killed or captured. The invasion provoked the anti-U.S. demonstrations in Latin America and Europe and further embittered U.S.-Cuban relations. Poorly planned and executed, the invasion subjected President Kennedy to severe criticism at home. The blame was thrown on the CIA and the refusal of Kennedy to authorize air cover for the invasion force, but perhaps more crucial was the fact that the uprising the exiles hoped and needed to spark didn't happen. In December 1962, Castro released 1,113 captured rebels in exchange for $53 million in food and medicine. Most recently, it has been discovered that the CIA task force planning the invasion had predicted that the invasion's goals were unachievable without the assistance of the U.S. military. To this day, it is still unclear whether Kennedy or the CIA chief, Alan Dulles, knew of the assessment. This brought the American citizens' faith in their country and leaders down a notch, as did the President Kennedy assassination. By the fall of 1963, President John F. Kennedy and his political advisors were preparing for the next presidential campaign. Although he had not yet formally announced his candidacy, it was clear that President Kennedy was going to run, and he seemed confident about his chances for re-election. At the end of September, the president traveled west, speaking in 9 different states in less than 1 week. The trip was meant to put a spotlight on natural resources and conservation efforts. But JFK also used it to sound out themes such as education, national security, and world peace for his run in 1964. As he and Mrs. Kennedy arrived in Texas, crowds of excited people lined the streets and waved to the Kennedys. The car turned off Main Street at Dealey Plaza around 12:30 p.m. As it was passing the Texas School Book Depository, gunfire suddenly reverberated in the plaza. Bullets struck the president's neck and head. The president's car then sped off to a nearby hospital where he died. An hour later, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested for the murder of patrolman J.D. Tippit and the assassination of President Kennedy. On Sunday morning, November 24th, Oswald was scheduled to be transferred from police headquarters to the more secure county jail. Viewers across America suddenly saw a assailant point the pistol and fire at blank range. The man was identified as Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner. Oswald died 2 hours later at the hospital. Jack Ruby claimed that rage at Kennedy's murder was the motive for his actions, although nothing has been proven. Ruby died 3 years ago of cancer and was never given the chance to appear in his new trial. The Bay of Pigs invasion and the Kennedy assassination appalled and horrified the country. The music of that time soon began to reflect the mood of all of these events. The 1960s were a time of upheaval in society, fashion, attitudes, and most of all music. Before 1963, the music of the 60s still reflected the sound, style, and beliefs of the previous decade. Many of the hit records were by artists who had found mainstream success in the 1950s, like Elvis Presley, Ray Charles, and the Everly Brothers. In 1963 and the years to follow, a number of social influences changed what popular music was and gave birth to the diversity that we experience with music today. The assassination of Kennedy, the escalation of the war in Vietnam, and the forward progress of the civil rights movement all greatly impacted the mood of American culture, and the music soon began to reflect that mood as well. The British invasion also began around 1963 with the arrival of the Beatles on the music scene, and the type of rabid fandom that followed would soon change the way people viewed and interacted with musicians forever. This has been a flashback of the 60s, and now for your weather on this beautiful Monday morning with Travis Wheeler after the break.